And then when did you decide to call it? When did you decide to say, hey, this is not worth our...
Technically, the website's still live. This is such a random aside, but I think another thing that I've learned about e-commerce in general is that, like, if you build it, they won't come. No one's gonna come.
By the way, that's not just e-commerce. I think that's product in general. Like you could have, I saw that in the app world all the time. You could have the best app in any category that was beautifully designed and so thoughtful, but if no one knew about it, who cares? Like no one would ever find your app. We're back with another episode of The Hard Pivot. This week, I've got a phenomenal guest, Samantha. She's going to tell the story of her company, Endless Commerce, and the things that came before that led her to where she is right now. Just as a quick reminder, The Hard Pivot is a podcast about, and I'm trying to get this right, I'll figure it out over time, startup founders' pivots and the highs and the lows, but really the nitty-gritty of what actually happened. How did they realize, and then what do they do once they realize that something wasn't going right? So I'm your host, Zach Roseman. I'm the founder of Draftboard, but even more important, or much more important than that, is Samantha. Samantha, do you go by Sam or Samantha? I should have asked that earlier.
Everybody calls me Sam. You can call me
Okay, Sam. Okay, you know, I figured, but you never want to presume.
Well, I appreciate that. And also, for part of this story, I'll be Samantha, because Samantha is what people call me when I'm in trouble. Okay. So we'll do that. I'll transition from Sam to Samantha to Sam throughout the
Right. We'll take on the impression of your investors, right? Sam, when we first invest, and then Samantha, right. Things aren't going great. Okay, awesome. And by the way, for everyone's knowledge, again, I'm going to do this from every time I interview someone. Some people I know and I have a relationship with. Some people I don't. I just met Sam like a week and a half ago when someone said, oh, you're launching this podcast? You should talk to Sam. And we did a quick call and she told me a little bit and I was like, yeah, you're perfect. So pretty much everything I'm going to hear today is for the first time is the same as the listeners, whoever they are, whether they're 5 people or 50 people or however many more we hope, are going to hear for the first time. So with that, Sam, can you give us a quick background on you, where you're from, just like the quick background, then we'll dig in deeper later.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm from California. I went to college on the East Coast, met my husband and business partner now, Brian, in college, and he whisked me to New York. He whisked me away to New York right after college. So we spent about 15 years on the East Coast, and then 3 kids later made our way back to sunny Southern California, where I am right now.
Wow. Okay. So Southern California, like San Diego, LA.
Like LA area. Yeah. A little bit south of LA. But I've spent time in the Bay Area too. Went to high school up there. So kind of like made a big L shape across the country, and founded my businesses, most of them when I was in New York. So we can. By
the way, for the viewers, like I can't hold back. That's foreshadowing. If you noticed, businesses.
I didn't expect to be this problematic / prolific, but yeah. When we were in college, Brian was like, I could be a stay-at-home dad. Like you are like, whatever, driven, and I was like,
that's my dream.
It was his too. I'm like, we can work from home, but we will be working. Right.
My dream is also to be a stay-at-home dad. It hasn't worked out, and my wife is trying as hard as she can, but not quite yet. I knew from an early age that I wanted kids, and I wanted a bunch of kids. So I was like, that's perfect. I want to be a stay-at-home dad. I'll take care of the kids.
Speaking of hard pivots, I interviewed with Google when I was graduating college, and this is such a dumb story. We're gonna have to edit this out. So
no, there's no editing on this podcast.
There's no editing on the podcast. So I forget, it was like a sales job. I think a sales and marketing job. And I have I don't have a double major, or a dual degree, but I effectively minored, even though they didn't have minors where I was, in like physics and astronomy. And I'm an English major. So a lot of what I do, I bring this like kind of technical but very verbal perspective to it, and that's part of what's allowed me to start as many different types of businesses as I have. So I'm like interviewing for a job at Google. This is like 2007, 2006, and the marketing manager's like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I was like, I had already met Brian. Like I knew he was the one. I was like, well, I see myself like married with a couple of kids. I did not get the job.
So far from probably what she was expecting to hear.
Yeah, I didn't know how to interview. It was like the first interview I'd ever had.
Right. Well, are you like a junior or a senior in college at that point?
I was a senior. And I just answered honestly. And it was the honest truth. That did happen. I also started multiple businesses. I also was like a good worker. But that part of my life story I knew was going to happen. And I was like, I don't know what this job at
Right.
Google is going to be, but I do know that I'm marrying Brian and having kids.
Right. And this is total aside, but it's interesting, like line of conversation. Like it's also like, it sounds like it wasn't like a negotiable thing. Oh, like maybe or maybe not, I'll have kids. You're like, no, I want to have kids. And like, like, why would I hide that?
Yeah, I wanted that.
Right.
And I personally did not feel that that would limit my productivity whatsoever,
Yeah.
and it hasn't.
Right.
But I didn't realize what a loaded answer, particularly for a woman to give that answer, like that was super disqualifying. They were like, nope. I was like, oh shit, I should have said something else. I just didn't know
Also
better.
at the age of, how old are you? 22,
I was
20?
21.
Yeah. Right. So by the way, it's funny. I have a good friend from high school that we haven't kept as much touch in, but she also went to work at Google in sales and marketing and something, first job out of college, had 3 kids, 3 boys within like 4 or 5 years. And then was done having kids by the age of like 28 or something. And
Yeah.
she's like loving life because
She's
you know
young and
there
energy.
is I know I don't want to there is something to be said. Like I had kids later in life. I wish I had kids earlier. I wish I'd met my wife earlier, but like I really think there's something to be said about having kids earlier and like figuring out a way especially in tech. There are now ways to integrate that into your life much more so than I think the standard way of thinking suggests.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. It's worked out great. I had no idea that I was just too young to realize that like people didn't view that as compatible with like also professional ambitions. That wasn't the only
Right.
answer I gave. I also said like some other stuff that I wanted to do with my life. But putting that in the mix was like, oh, no, she's not the one.
Oh, but you know what sucks about that? It like reinforces the bad, I say the bad but justified behavior of candidates in those kind of interviews where when they ask you like a canned question like that, you have a pre-canned answer, right? It's like, what's your biggest weakness? Oh, I'm too perfectionist, right? And so it's like the companies complain about that, but then when someone like you gives a real answer that's like unexpected, it's like disqualifying, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I had, it was truly, I mean, I had jobs all through high school and college, but it was really one of the first like forward looking, not like, are you going to show up on time for this? Like,
Right.
yes, ma'am. But like really one of the few first forward looking interviews I'd had in that way. And I was deeply unprepared. But
Right.
after that, I mean, that prepared me for maybe not totally canned answers, but like better answers.
Different answers, let's say. Okay, cool. So that
Anyway.
that was a fun aside. I love talking about family too. I have 2 kids myself, so yeah, we could maybe save that for after the podcast. But
Let's do another one.
okay, so you don't go to work at Google as your first job.
Don't go to work at Google. So, quick professional history. I spent a very, very brief time in finance. Brian and a bunch of my other friends got these like amazing jobs in New York in finance, and I was like, oh, that's the thing to do. I took like one econ class. So I applied for a job at a hedge fund. I got a job at a hedge fund, and then like the market crashed, and so that was very short lived. Other people's hedge funds did better, like Brian, and he stayed.
Yep.
So he stayed for 10 years in like finance land, doing the most fascinating stuff. And so I got this like really great like side education in what he was working on, and like credit derivatives and collateralized debt obligations and like
And
real,
this is circa 2007, 2008, right? So this is like
yeah,
financial crisis front lines.
yeah, really
Yeah.
front lines. Like, and they timed it well, and so his fund did great. And for the next 10 years, he spent some time in on the sales side, and then some time on the research side. And I left there, and I started to work at like smaller tech startups in New York, and I was working on sales and marketing teams. And then I had this idea, and this is the part of the story, like if anyone listening has already heard me talk, will be repetitive, and I apologize. But my story is
But
that
we didn't. Don't you remember the long document you signed that said you're going to share this on every social channel?
Exactly. They're like, oh, the spatula girl again? So, so I had this idea for a one-piece spatula. This was like years before I did anything with it. And I loved to cook, and I was a competitive cyclist. So like the things that we would do were like, pick gear for our like cycling obsession, and then we would cook. And it was a very virtuous circle, because we would bike 100 miles and then eat pasta. That really worked.
Okay, I'm so fascinated what the innovation in the spatula was, though.
Oh, so it was the first, I have one right here. It was the first all silicone spatula.
Okay, for everyone who's just listening, she just literally picked up a spatula right next to her desk, because this clearly comes up often enough in calls.
Here it is.
Oh my God, this is amazing. Amazing. Okay, cool.
I don't have the grinder with me. We'll get to the grinder in a second. But this spatula was like kind of a little bit disruptive to an industry that like everybody has a spatula, right? Everybody knows what it is, and whether or not you like to cook, if you have leftovers, like you have a spatula. So it was like really kind of disruptive. It was like the first one, and the industry I think was a little bit surprised by me coming in with this like crowdfunded thing. And it was one of the perfect examples of like, it's almost better when you don't know, because
sorry. So was the innovation the shape of the spatula? That looks very familiar to me. So is that just because
you're right? This was the first one that's all silicone. Most of them are like metal handle, wooden handle, plastic handle, maybe a silicone like rubber blade. And so here's where we get to the next piece, which then the piece after that is the pivot. This spatula was so easy for everyone to rip off. And I made it patent pending and whatever, but like the first year we were in the market, people were stunned. They were like we won awards, and I had chefs, like famous chefs, calling me saying, when can I get some? It was really weird. I was like, this isn't that complicated. Like, why me? But okay, I'll take the gift.
Wait, can I pause you there? Because I feel like we skipped a whole bunch of steps. Okay. So you have a cycling obsession, and you're eating a lot of pasta, and you sit there one day and you're frustrated that, I don't know, one of the spatulas disintegrates or falls apart, or it's hard to clean or something like that, right?
Yes.
And so you have this idea for this, what if we had a one-piece thing? Okay, how did you go from that to like launching a product, like crowdfunding? Like what was like, did you talk to manufacturers? Did you research materials? I know this isn't like this, for me, like this podcast is great because it's about pivots, but I also just love the business side of it and just like digging into some of the details.
So I'm a total dork, and I love like just teaching myself how to do stuff. This was like an experiment in my kitchen. So I'm like, the first, piece is, hey, what if ... and like, we're going to make this thing out of one piece, and why don't they make it that way? And I'm like, well, this is so obvious. The Illuminati, like they should make it this way. The Illuminati of kitchenware. And I went
imagining like a bunch of guys sitting in a room with smoke in the air and
totally. That is actually, I think, probably real. So I thought, well, maybe it's because of a manufacturing limitation, or maybe it's because the cost of silicone is kind of a premium material. It's cheaper to do it these other ways. And so I went researching there, and I'll tell this story in as short a way as I can, but I did call manufacturers.
Or as long, whatever you
want.
Or
as long. Okay, well.
We have time.
So I prototype it in my kitchen. I buy a bunch of silicone molding materials and Sculpey from the internet, and I made my mold. And I made my prototype, and then I made a mold out of a prototype, and then I poured silicone on a chopstick. and I make this thing, and I'm like, okay.
The chopstick was there for like structural integrity. Essentially?
There's a nylon core inside.
Wow.
I'm bending it on the camera for anyone who's just listening. That makes them stiff, because silicone is just inherent. I mean, you can make it stiffer, but it doesn't have a whole lot of structure to it. It's very rubbery. So I get to a place where I've sort of validated this prototype for myself. I'm like, okay, I can make 10 more and they're going to be my holiday gifts for everyone. But if I do that with silicone that I bought on the internet, then I'm going to kill someone. Like,
Right.
they're going to
Right.
cook with this thing. It's going to like leach into their spaghetti sauce. So I started to call manufacturers and I was like, hey, I have like this way of doing it. Is it possible? And we worked through, eventually selected a manufacturer. We worked through like the manufacturing methodology. And
And this is post Kickstarter or this is pre Kickstarter?
this was pre-Kickstarter. This is all pre-Kickstarter.
So you're
So then
spending some money, your own money at this point to like fund an
yeah,
idea.
yeah. And most of this whole story is a bootstrap story until we get to the very end of it. Uh, but yeah, I don't know, at this point spent maybe like 10 grand in
Okay.
not counting, I mean, obviously not counting my time, but in like
Yeah. Actual dollars.
actual dollars, ordering prototypes and working on some, maybe not 10 grand. I don't know. To get to the prototype was really cheap. That was a few $100.
Right.
But by the time I got to the Kickstarter, I had spent 10 grand. So, so to tell the story sort of in order, I prototype this thing. I start to call manufacturers. We work out a manufacturing methodology that will work. This is me like just a lot of self-education, figuring out how silicone behaves and what manufacturing methodologies like are used to make silicone things in the world. And I just figured it out, really.
Because again, I'm coming from this with zero knowledge of this space.
Yeah.
So talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old. But because the silicone you ordered for that first prototype was just random silicone, you had no, like, quality wise, you didn't. It was just a sort of a test. And then you go to manufacturers and they're like, oh no, there's different kinds and different advantages of different ones. And then is that what you mean when you say like?
Yes, to a degree. Manufacturers, for the most part, are reactive. They're not going to necessarily tell you the best way to do something. They're going to tell you the most efficient way to do the thing that you've pretty much already delineated, defined, and described to them. And this gets to like the third. Now, this is premeditating my third business, which is like, I'm going to teach people how to do this because it was really hard. And I just figured a bunch of stuff out. So yes, I first kind of like educated myself on available manufacturing methodologies for silicone, identified that like compression molding this silicone in a certain way was the right way to do it. I wanted it to be completely seamless. So what we were trying to avoid was like, they're called positioning pins or location pins, and they're sort of like parts of the tool. You can think about compression molding like muffins in muffin tins. So first you have to make the muffin tin, and then you can bake your muffins. The spatula is a muffin, but we have to make the muffin tin. And a lot of times, there's other things, there's characteristics of the muffin tin that are imparted into the muffin. Like one of those things is like these location pins. And so I figured out a way to avoid the need for location pins without having the nylon core inside, like waft to one side effectively. So as I'm kind of self-educating on all of that and talking to manufacturers, and like I called I called a rocket scientist who was like, I found the guy who wrote the like paper of record from the US military on O-rings for rockets. I'm like, this guy knows about
When I hear O-ring, I hear like the Columbia shuttle, or was it the
Challenger.
Columbia or the Challenger? Yeah.
Yeah. So he's the guy. This is like, 1985 or whatever. And he's doing all of this research to help avoid that exact sort of thing, which has to do with like the silicone expanding and contracting just as any material would when it's hot or cold.
Wow.
So he kind of writes like the definitive paper on high heat silicone, because as I'm going through this research thing, I'm also like, okay, well, this is more than a holiday gift. I'm going to think about commercializing it. How do I walk that path? And I start buying like every spatula out there and reading all of the marketing materials on them. And that was like really interesting but disheartening, because everyone was making these wildly different claims. Like you'd have manufacturers claiming 800 degree Fahrenheit heat resistance, and I'm like, wow, that's really high. Like what's that material? I want that. And then you'll have other manufacturers like well respected brands that are like 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 400 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm like, what's the difference? And does that have a cost implication? Because also the higher cost one was like claiming a lower heat resistance. All these little nuances of like, how am I going to
Yeah,
get
that also gets
viral?
your right. That probably also gets your like red flags going. Like, hold on, higher
Yeah,
cost is advertising a lower temperature.
yeah.
Something's
There's
not
like
adding up with the lower cost guys.
something's amiss.
Yeah,
All this is to say that there were just hours of like searching and phone calls and reading and all of that that went into finally figuring out like what the right silicone was to use and how it could be manufactured. And this rocket scientist, like he lives in San Diego near the base, and he picks up the phone. And he wasn't expecting my phone call. I just cold called him. I literally found
right.
his number in the yellow pages because those still existed.
Oh my God, a time when people still answered their phones, right?
Yeah, and I said, listen, sir, like I'm this is the kitchen product I want to make, and I really want to make it out of like the best food safe but most heat resistant silicone I can find. And I'm a little lost because everyone's claiming these different things, and the manufacturers are telling me to go like, look at like Mvnifest, which is a huge chemical manufacturing business. And I'm like, so I'm going through all of the data sheets from Mvnifest for the 700 types of silicone that they offer. I'm like, which
Right.
one of these is the right one? And they're for all different sorts of things. Use this when you're trying to make a tube that's going inside your body as a biocompatible like,
Yep.
medical device versus like use this
But it's
for a
totally
tire.
inscrutable for someone who's coming in without a chemicals background, without an industry background.
Mostly inscrutable. Yes, for someone like that. For me, I like screwed it. I screwed it. I figured it. But generally, it was an overwhelming body of knowledge, and having a chemical engineering degree would have been really handy. But I just had a non-minor in physics. Um, so I get the guy. This is a good snippet. He's like, sweetheart, if you can figure out food safe silicone that's heat resistant to 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, call me and we'll be billionaires. I was like, okay. Like, I get that it's a high bar. I find a
But
manufacturer.
was he
What?
saying though? Was he saying though that the silicone out in the market that was being used with at 350 degrees was potentially dangerous? Like it wasn't strong enough, or was he saying what was he implying by that? I guess.
He was implying that the amount that food safe silicone and at the amount of heat resistance that I wanted, which was like, let's beat the market, let's find the very, very best silicone out there, that didn't exist yet. And that if it
Got it.
did exist, it would be in very high demand and that he would want to be part of it. He was so amazing and so generous with his time. And I came away from that phone call with a much better sense of I guess some confidence around my ability to be technical in this industry. I'm like, oh, everyone's just making it up. So if
Mm,
I do more research, then I can maybe not be making it up and do it better. And that ended up becoming a core of how we differentiated ourselves in the market, was that I did find the most heat resistant silicone that I could that was still food safe. I found the best silicone and like used that. And that in addition to just the single piece-ness of it was a huge part of our ability to just break into the market with something that again is like a commodity that everybody has, but that was with this fresh point of view. And when after speaking to manufacturers and kind of working through the how of it all, uh, it became clear that I would need to make a lot at like really scale this. I couldn't just make 100 and experiment. And so that's when I decided to run a Kickstarter campaign. I'm like, well, I just put at this point I'm like, $15,000 in. I'm like, okay, I really need to just make sure that there's some external validation that this is a good idea and it's commercial, rather than just having like my friends say, hey Sam, this is cool.
right.
You have to kind of go to that next level of like market validation effectively.
Right.
So I ran a Kickstarter campaign and that was quite successful for relative
And
to my
that's
expectations.
that's relatively early in Kickstarter's journey, right?
which was a big part of what worked for us. It was early in their journey. And I had a lot of creative friends in New York that were doing projects. So I had been a Kickstarter backer for like all sorts of people doing these cool creative publishing projects and art projects and music projects. And it was really just getting going. So this is like, as I was planning kind of 2011, and then we launched in 2012. And Kickstarter was newsworthy at the time. Being a Kickstarter campaign was a part of the like, I don't know, benefits, bullet points. Yeah, the zeitgeist, exactly. And so that in and of itself was newsworthy, and I had just created this like perfect storm of earned media with like a fun, cool, cute new way to do things. And I was fairly ironically, I can't find the words right now, but I was good at telling our story.
I'm curious about words that were supposed to be, but okay, you're good at telling the story. No, but I can see that you're like effusive. You clearly are invested in what you were working on, and you like are excited about it, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like how many people get excited about like high performance silicone? Okay, you do.
Yeah, like effusive, and I was really, really able to get the word out. And then also people were like, "Oh, you did this on Kickstarter? What's Kickstarter like? And what's it like to build a campaign? And can you help me build my campaign?" And so this
It's like mutually beneficial, also.
Yes. And it snowballed. And so I had thought that like we would start with this, and then we would move to something that was more, and here's where the first to second paper comes from, like more technical. Because this to me, even though I did a lot of research and it was a fun, nerdy thing to do, it's silicone on a stick. Like I'm not so blinded to the complexity of it all, or so enamored of that brand that I felt like that would be enough to be forever. And it wasn't. So the first year we went to a bunch of trade shows, and we're getting into the news because of Kickstarter and because of just the whole story of it all. And by the third year, people were like, "What makes this so special?" And I was like, "Well," and it was really...
Was that because they had heard about it so many times that they're just like, "Oh yeah, of course," like a one, or was it because they started seeing copycats all over the place, and you kind of forget what the world was like when you had a more inferior product, and you just assume that this superior one was always around, and like, what's so special now 3 years into your crazy journey, but for them it's just a trip to the grocery store.
Just a trip to the grocery store. So It was exactly that. And I thought, okay, well,
isn't that wild how quickly people forget, right? Or people, they don't even remember a time when things were so, again, people are going to laugh at me, be like, so vastly different. It's a freaking spatula. But at the same time, it was unique. It was different. It was something that people clearly were clamoring for, and they didn't, or they would clamor for, but they didn't know it. Sorry, I'm talking to myself now.
No, but you're saying all the right things. So it was exactly that. It was, and I would have to go back into the kind of like time machine of it all to revalidate for myself. Like we were on the cover of the Wall Street Journal.
Wow.
Or maybe the Wall Street Journal business section, but like the cover of some, and like New York Magazine gift guide, like the centerfold of it.
Wow.
And you kind of lose sight of moments like that are like total external validation of what you've done is cool and special and newsworthy in its own way, and neat. And then 3 years
different.
later,
I think most importantly, different, right?
It was different.
Right.
And then
did
a couple years later.
Did you anticipate building a company around this? Like, what was your journey of thinking around, this is a cool product, to let me list it on Kickstarter, and then you get the validation there, and then all of a sudden you get earned media, and then all of a sudden it's flying off the shelves? Like, was there ever a vision, I'm going to build like a consumer brand around it? Or was it like, I have this one hit wonder, like this is great, but I want to move on to something different after this? Oops, I just hit my mic.
It was a combination, because I've always known that I would build businesses, and I've always been very driven in that way. I also knew that this one thing, or at least I thought that this one thing was not going to be enough to build a big enough business around, but it was also cool, and it was a good training ground for what was next. So and I figured if I'm asking people to invite me into their kitchens, which is a safe space and a space where, a safe space in a lot of ways, right? Like we're inside the home, but also we're inside your pot. Like you're mixing your food. And so I
Yep.
knew that I needed to establish
And
a
your kids'
brand
food.
and your kids' food. I'm like, I need to establish like a brand around this so that I can establish trust and continue to earn that trust. So I knew at least that it couldn't be just like a random like gadget one hit wonder without a lot of backing and asking people to trust me personally that like I had done, I made the phone call to the rocket scientist on their behalf. But what I thought was that, and this is why we named the business Get It Right, I thought we'll just make other products that are the best of their kind, products that
Mm.
get it right. And that could be anything. It could be a spatula. It could be like, I have a great idea for a bicycle helmet. And I was cycling a lot. So I'm like, okay, my next thing could be like a bike helmet. And that would check the box for me of being like a little bit more complicated and a little bit more like, robust or whatever. There's probably some ego wrapped up in that like I just didn't want to be viewed
Wait,
as
can
like
I can
a
I I want to focus on that for a second. Did you how often, because it sounds like you did you have the thought, oh, but it's just a spatula and I don't want to be known as the spatula girl? Like was
well,
that some was that a driving force for you? And I'm not trying to like insult. I'm actually trying to like understand like the psyche part of it.
the psyche part of it is at first it was I don't think an entire business can be built
Mm,
around this one thing. A little, I can sell some, but that was
right.
different to me than like building an empire.
Right.
That was the first part of it. So psychologically, very, very egoless, more just like, yeah, academically, I'm selling
Very
$10
soberly.
spatulas. Yeah, and I'm making $2 at a time. And so for me to make any meaningful amount of income for this as a serious full-time business for myself, I'm going to have to sell an extraordinary number. And how am I going to do that? Dot, dot, dot. So that was the first piece of it. That it gets more ego wrapped later because they're later, once there were a bunch of ripoffs, I'm like, okay, not only is this viewed as simplistic and I'm having a hard time communicating just how wonderful this line of products is, but also like I can, okay, I'll just do something bigger. Like if that's the I don't know, assessment that this is really basic, then like I'll just make something that's not basic. Like,
So when did you
market.
start, when did like the crescendo of, earned media and sales and success from the original spatula, when did you start to feel,
What type of way?
yeah.
Well,
And was there a particular trigger? Um,
yeah, there were a couple triggers. There, yeah, I can remember them so specifically. So,
because, and again, I say that because I remember, and again, for me, it's much more recent, right? Like
yeah,
7 months ago, I remember the things that I was looking at. I was like, the moments where I was like, wait, something's not going right. And
right.
very different from you because you actually had a successful product out, but still, at some point, you realize it sounds like, wait, something's not quite as it needs to be if this is going to be sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, it's in a way, the first piece is less of a like 90-degree or 180-degree pivot. It's more just like here's the natural and intelligent business evolution of the from the foundation that we've established. So we established this foundation for a single product. And I thought that maybe I would make like other gear that was like one-offs of good things. And then I start to interact with buyers in the kitchenwares industry, and they're like, what do you have that's next? And I'm like, oh, I guess I got to think of something really fast. But I figured this one out, so like, why don't I just make a whole line of kitchen tools that go along with this thing? Like that makes a lot of sense. So we start to do that. um, and that was what was going to work. So I kind of like I let go of the idea of putting non-adjacent products under this brand,
Got
but
it.
I always kind of wanted to make more complicated other products. So we're like building this business, and it's working. I mean, it took a few years for us to be really profitable, but it was definitely working, and we were starting to get into lots of different stores, and eventually we got into Target, and so the machine's kind of running. And I just kind of had to like bite the bullet. I mean, and I love cooking, so this was fine. It was like a totally great identity to create around like being this line of silicone kitchenwares. And, I was very much from a founder perspective, like my face was in the front of it. And I was very happy to build that. And the unit economics are just tough. You're selling a lot of things for not that expensive, and it was easy to rip off. And I remember there's an industry a trade show for the housewares industry, and it's usually called the Houseware Show. That's what we all call it. It's the Inspired Home Show this year. They kind of change the name sometimes. And I remember standing in our booth. Maybe we had I don't know, like 5 products at that point. I was standing in the booth, and this buyer was like, "What are your KSPs?" I was like, "What's a KSP?" And I think I figured it out really quickly, but I don't think I asked her that. But I'm like, well, and I start to list out the things, that make it special and cool. And she's like, yeah, but all of these other guys have that too, and they're cheaper. And I'm like, okay. At some point, I see the writing on the wall. We're a startup and we're bootstrapped. It's going to be really hard for us to outcompete OXO or like Tovolo or any of the other really big businesses out there. So the next business I started is called Voltaire, and it's a coffee grinder.
Wait,
TLDR.
before you get to that, so what
Yeah.
happens with Get It Right? Do you
It
sell
just
it?
keeps going.
Okay.
It keeps going. Yeah. And
But you step back from leadership?
no, not at all. I mean, I have now. I sold it, but we'll get to that in a minute. No, it just kept going, and so pretend that we're still under Gearland. I'm like, I need to come up with a more differentiated product.
Yeah.
And grow this line. And I come up with this idea
Within that same business, or
within the
separate?
same business, or at least within the same industry. Because I thought, well, I could just keep making gadgets, but like I'm still going to have the same problems. They're going to be easy to rip off. They're going to have tight unit economics, and I'm going to have extraordinary retail penetration, which made for a very complicated business to run. And so therefore, just high, foundational operating costs, and a constant need to innovate, but it totally in air quotes. Wasn't that innovative anymore. It was just different shapes of the same thing, and made in a beautiful and focused and very design centric way. But I kind of viewed our ability to innovate, again, I'm doing air quotes, within that industry as somewhat limited. We're just going to make more gadgets.
Right.
So,
Right. I by the way, I can sympathize. I came from a world. My last business, we owned over 50 different mobile apps. And at some point, I sort of grew up through the ranks. And when I took over, I was just like, most of these are just commodities, and weather apps, translation apps, PDF scanning apps. And we were making profit on them, but in some of them, we'd already seen some low price, kind of gray market actors start to take shortcuts and do things that we wouldn't do. And you look at it and you're like, this is not sustainable long term. We have to either take much bigger swings, or we have to accept that we're just in a commodity business and we're just always going to be fighting for that little crack of margin, and which wasn't exciting to me. So I wanted to go after the first path. But that is a very big pivot moment, because you're just like, the thing that I've built my business on, that uniqueness that I started with, has not been copied, because there's low barriers to entry. And it's that, like you said, it's that conversation about KSPs from that buyer. It's just that clearly stood out as like a moment to you.
Yeah. It was just, and that was a moment, shortly after reflecting on that moment, I just thought, okay, it's clear that I have to do something more spectacular, and I can still do it within this brand and ecosystem, but we have to level up.
Right.
So,
by the way, and one last thing on that is, you probably knew at that point, either in the back of your head or in the front of your head, you knew that this was a challenge you had, but it was sort of coming together with this random buyer coming to you and saying it to you, and in a way that just triggered something that was like, oh, okay, yeah, we do have this bigger. The problem is bigger than maybe I was giving it credit for. Is that right?
Yeah, we for sure knew. But again, it was a healthy and at that point profitable business. It just wasn't going to go
Totally.
to the moon. And
right.
But it was work, and we created jobs and all of the things. It was doing a lot of good things that I felt were good in the world. I just had bigger ambitions. So I'm like,
Yep.
okay, what if I make something bigger and better than this? And I was also really into coffee. Liking cooking, liking biking, and liking coffee are like frequent. Those three things are sort of like they go together. And so we would go like on the road to race, and everyone would want to bring like their espresso stuff with them, and it was hard to do. So like we all had AeroPresses. That was like a great portable way to make good espresso in the morning on the road. But we would have to grind our beans before we left. And then, if you're a coffee nerd, you're like, oh, I ground my beans like more than 45 seconds before pulling the shot.
By the way, you're speaking to someone who, at the age I'm 37 right now. I decided to get into coffee like 2 months ago. So I'm just at the beginning of my journey. So I can aspire to where you are.
So like, what one needs is a really good portable coffee grinder that can make espresso level grind. That's not a hand mill, because we would be up at like 4 a.m. before
Cranking
racing,
that thing.
cranking the hand mill. I'm like, what the fuck are we doing? So like, what if I made like a portable coffee grinder, but that was battery operated? And that was the pivot. That was the moment. So I start to do my thing, and I like research what everyone would want out of an espresso grinder, which is different than a coffee grinder, by the way. You need consistency, you need the ability for very fine grind. And I put together this like wish list for myself for what my perfect coffee grinder would be that, I had also
It's your product requirements list.
My product requirements list. Yeah. I wrote my PRD and then I'm like, then I get into what we would call this is scope creep. At the time, it was just me imagining cool shit. But like,
by the way, when I first had the idea for Draftboard, and I just raised funding, and this is when Draftboard, the V1 of it was like a recruiting marketplace. Let's without getting into the details. And then I called my friend who's a senior product guy at Instagram, and I was like, hey, can you come sit with me and my founding engineer, and we'll present to you what we want to build? And he sits through about 20 minutes of it, and he's like, this is awesome. Cut 75%. And my jaw just dropped open. I was like, but I already cut. He's like, nope, cut more. He's like, this is what you should be building in 5 years, right? Like, start with what is the MVP? Because like, this is cool. You'll never get that done. You'll never launch if that's what you want to actually build.
Yeah. And I didn't I didn't have that level of mentorship. You're lucky. And I just didn't have that level of self-discipline. I was like, what I want to do, because I was counteracting this other thing, which is that my thing was too simple. Right? Like that's
the lesson you took away, right? The lesson you took away was like, the more complex I make it, the harder it is to copy.
Yeah. So I was in like this more is more moment, and I had some objectives. I needed something where the gross margin dollars coming out of every sale were going to be high. That was one requirement. Where ripping it off would be very difficult. Which I could achieve through some level of like IP registration and ownership, which we did, but also just like, this is a hard thing. So the barrier to just, entry is inherently higher, even if it's not classically protected by a patent. But I got both. I wanted something where the business model was a multitude. And so for a freshness sensing coffee grinder, the business model was like 5 tiers. It was, we can sell these coffee grinders. We can sell these coffee grinders and a system that allows you to reorder subscriptions to beans. Oh, recurring revenue. That's rad. Then we can create a way to offer this system at an industrial scale, and if you're in the coffee roasting industry, you'll know, but for everybody else, bean waste is the highest impact cost in coffee roasting in general. And that happens in 2 places. It happens while the beans are being roasted, or shortly, like post roast. Basically, there's a bunch of waste that goes into it, wasted coffee beans. And then also on the shelf, because if you are a coffee bean seller of any repute, you have a very tight shelf life on how long since roast you're willing to sell your beans. So like a really good coffee roaster will be like, 10 days after this is roasted, they're going in the donation bin. Like, we won't even sell them at a discount because they have their like reputation to maintain. So I thought, okay, well, we can like industrialize this technology, this algorithm that we've written for coffee bean freshness sensing, so that instead of just doing it on a date basis, we're actually doing it on some other more intelligent basis. And that's not going to necessarily work for like the individual 1 pound bags on the shelf, but it will work in the back room where
Mm.
bags and bags of coffee beans are stored for at the coffee shop. Um,
By the way, it reminds me, I heard of a startup recently that they're placing stickers on packages of meat, sliced meat in the grocery store, and the sticker changes color based on the like whatever chemical emissions of the meat
VOCs.
as it you know it better than I
Yeah.
do, and so it can tell you rather than like we packed this on this day, it's good for this day. It can actually tell you in real time how
Yes.
it's if it's safe still to buy.
Yeah. And that's sort of the system that we built. Nothing to do with safety really, but like, will your beans be
Optimal,
as
right?
fresh? And yeah, I could really get into that, but I won't.
So
uh,
you come up with this wish list. You come up with this
yeah,
grand
and then
plan.
and step 5 is we're going to sell the data. So we're going to sell grinders. We're going to sell subscriptions. We're going to sell an industrialized version of this system. We're going to sell, maybe I only got to 4, but in any case, and we're going to sell the data because we're going to collect a ton of data around coffee bean behavior and freshness and staling trends and all of that. So I thought, okay, this is an interesting business model. Maybe this is even like a venture fundable business model that's not a commodity and that will like do all of the things that I need it to do for my business. And so so we invent the system and we design and invent the grinder and we start to manufacture. We run a Kickstarter campaign. It didn't not nearly raise as much money as we really needed. It was in the total uncanny valley of like we raised $150,000 and for I forget how many customers, like 1,500 customers. That's the uncanny valley because you owe 1,500 people this expensive thing. But also you haven't raised enough money to really cover the whole nut.
Right.
And I was like a very, very, at least I tried to be like a really good creator in that, like when I collected money from people, I deeply obligated myself to delivering on what we made. And all
Right.
this is like gears going in the background, and we're still designing products as we do this. So it takes a couple of years to like design and commercialize the grinder and run the campaign for it all. And we're still continuing to launch gear products, and we get to the finish line with the grinder, and we didn't raise venture funding for it because Brian and I think he was really right, but like in his infinite wisdom and mercy as like a hedge fund person still at the time, he was like, these consumer products, like the venture model won't work for them. And I'm like, well, I don't know, Juicero just got like however many millions of dollars. So like, I'm pretty sure that this thing, like, I'm pretty sure I could go find some people to give me money. And
Talk
he was,
about top of market peak signals.
yeah, he was like pretty, you know, adamant that it wouldn't work and that it would be a bad idea for us to go, that we would fail our investors. And I think he was really right in retrospect. I do think we could have gotten funding for it, and I do think that we would have spent that money and needed to get more. And I don't know, maybe we would have made a lot of money for everyone, but maybe would have lost a lot of money for everyone. And we took that sort of thing as a couple and as a business partnership very seriously. We didn't want to lose money for people, so we bootstrapped that too, and we get to the point where we're like, we've put now hundreds of thousands of dollars in, all of Gear's profits and some of Brian's savings and my old savings, and it's all just kind of like going into this grinder. And they were like $185 a unit to manufacture, and that's what I wanted to sell
Wow.
them for. But
Wow.
we just weren't at scale with 1,500 of them, and not a few $1 million to put toward manufacturing. We couldn't be at a tier 1 manufacturer or even a tier 2 manufacturer. And I could get into the tiering of the manufacturing system. It doesn't necessarily imply a difference in quality of the end product, but it does imply a lot about how you get to the finish line. So if we had been making 20,000 units, we could have been at a tier one, or 50,000 units. We could have been at a tier one manufacturer and had much faster and more effective tooling available to us, and much faster and more effective like prototyping turns, and everything just gets like easier when it's bigger. And then unit costs go down as a result of that. And there's a reason why, Amazon can sell an Echo Show for $44 and a smaller manufacturer selling like a basic picture frame for $44. It's like they're just at scale. So I'm looking at this going like, there's another $2 million for me to put into this to make it all really work. And where am I going to get that $2 million? I just don't have it. So we pushed through. We delivered the first 1,500. We did we did 2,500 unit manufacturing run. And I thought, for me to keep going here is going to be, this isn't self-sustaining yet. And it will take a lot more for it to get there. And as good as this business model is theoretically, I'm just not there in terms of capitalization. So GIR at the time was doing, now GIR is doing great. Now it's like in Target, and it's in thousands and thousands of stores, and it still needed our energy. So I've got this thing that's kind of failing. Not like it doesn't have to fail, but it needs more money if it's not going to fail. And then I've got this thing that's really working, and I'm sucking away money from the thing that's working to put into the thing that's failing. But if I just kept the money in the thing that's working, I could grow it so much faster, and we could do so much more. And the other thing that went with the coffee grinder was an app, because the iPhone app and the Android app showed you how fresh your coffee beans were. I mean, the system really worked. And we can get into it on another podcast if you want to know how a complicated thing works. Like, forget the silicone story. This is like, there's VOC sensors and fans and load cells and Wi-Fi and BLE chips and an app. And so I've got this team that's building an app. And we kind of built it from scratch, which I don't think was necessarily the right way, but this is, 2016. So now we've got the advantage of 10 years of low code, no code tech behind us. But at the time, we really had to kind of like build this AWS stack to make this like an IoT device work. And as I'm managing through just the build of it all, I'm like, a lot of what we've built here, I could really use for inventory management for GIR. So that's the real pivot, was realizing that what I had built for this coffee grinder that was sucking the life out of us, but I love it, and I'm gonna Lazarus it one day. I'm gonna bring it back. But thought, okay, like, maybe we just have to pause on this expensive device, keep the tech that we built, use that tech to build effectively like an ERP for ourselves, take all of these spreadsheets that we use for inventory management and reform them into a system that would be useful for other people. And that was like the true beginning of Endless Commerce, was let's platform at least our way of managing data, because that is easier to scale than a $200 coffee grinder.
So that is an awesome story. And I shut my mouth many times because I wanted you to tell the full thing.
Good job.
That was awesome. I feel like there's so many good things in there to dig into, but like one that stuck out to me was from the very beginning with the coffee grinder, the espresso grinder. I want to make sure I get it right. You had this grand vision, right? Of here's step 1, step 2, step 3, steps 4. Here's how we're going to monetize. And it very much reminds me of my meeting with my friend Adam at Instagram, where he was just like, whoa. Sell the grinder. What he would have said was, sell the grinder first. Get out there. Just sell the grinder. Forget about everything else. Just sell the grinder. And it feels like this. How long was this journey of the grinder? Like, it sounds like a multi-year journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably 2014-ish. I was like, we got to build something more complicated. I like coffee. I know enough about this that like the learning curve will be achievable. Then in 2016, we basically had it designed by then and had some of the algorithms written. 2017, we kind of brought it to market. So 3 years.
And then when did you decide to call it? When did you decide to say, hey, this is not worth our...
Technically, the website's still live. This is such a random aside, but I think another thing that I've learned about e-commerce in general is that, like, if you build it, they won't come. Like, no one's gonna come.
By the way, that's not just e-commerce. I think that's product in general. Like, you could have, I saw that in the app world all the time. Like, you could have the best app in any category that was beautifully designed and so thoughtful, but if no one knew about it, who cares? Like, no one would ever find your app. And we saw that over and over again, where these indie developers were like there for the purity of the product, which I totally respect. But then no one bought their app because they didn't know how to market it, how to do advertising, a whole bunch of different things. Yeah. And that I think that holds true outside of just e-commerce.
Fair. And so without when I stopped doing demand generation for it, it just trickled off. And so technically it's still there, and the grinders actually are pretty great. We're not supporting the freshness sensing piece of the system.
Yeah.
But as a battery operated portable grinder, it's like rad, and you can buy one.
What was there a particular moment you remember sitting down maybe with Brian or with the team and saying, "Oh, this is this isn't going to work. We can't do this." And then there's a separate question. The follow up is, when did the light bulb go off in your head and say, "Wait a second, we've built something special here that we actually use differently in a much more interesting way or much bigger way"?
I think I had the extraordinary benefit and privilege of working on something that was working at the same time. So it wasn't so much for me, like, our pivot wasn't, we must stop and do something different completely. It was like, let's focus on the thing that's working. And it just felt very organic in that way. It wasn't like a boardroom meeting. It was like, should we order more of these? Should I keep going on building more features into the app? No, I got something else to do today, and I just did that.
What about the team that was working on it? Did they get reassigned? Were they continuing to work on it? How did you handle that part?
Yeah, it was all one big happy family. So we were working. Originally, it was going to be called the GIR Grinder, and we decided to give it a different name because GIR was, I don't know, it was a little bit unpronounceable, and Voltaire was such a rad name for a coffee company. There's a whole legend behind it that I really fell in love with, and a lot of my background is in branding. So I'm like, this is going to be a powerful brand that will have legs and longevity. And so anyway, we called it Voltaire, but it was all the same team that was working on it, from industrial design to marketing to manufacturing, commercialization. And the app had 2 people working on it. And those 2 people, I was like, hey guys, how about we use this infrastructure that we've built and some of the database architecture, and we just, because we needed inventory management for the coffee bean reordering part of what we were building a PIM, and we were building inventory management into this app. And I was like, guess what? If we also build a bunch of warehouse integrations and a way to create shipping labels, and this was the very beginnings of this idea that I didn't even know what ERPs were at the time.
Right.
I was just one system to rule them all. How great would that be if I could just not have to maintain 17 different spreadsheets, but just have it all in one place. Turns out NetSuite figured that out 4 years ago. but for me, it was this light bulb moment. So we just kept the team and kept working on GIR, and we started working on what would become later Endless, which
was the initial transition, okay, you two, let's build this out, but only for internal purposes? Was it we got this great thing, or did you already have a vision towards this could go far beyond GIR?
No, I knew this was the one.
Got it.
I knew that this idea was a venture scale idea that I had really earned insight into how to build. And
GIR was your first customer, it was your pilot customer to work out the kinks. Is that how you?
Yeah, and we were our own design partners, and
right.
So business number 4 that comes like sort of before Endless is we sold gear in 2021 and we started
Okay.
a supply chain management company basically. The proto of that business was very early on because our friends would ask for help with stuff. And I'm like, sure, I'll design your product for you. And like, here's what it cost me. And like, you're going to pay
Right.
me that. And then I'm going to give you your product. And then they would say, well, like, where do you manufacture? I'm like, oh, well, why don't you just use my factory? Like, so then we became a contract manufacturer. And they're like, well, who does your shipping? I'm like, well, we ship for ourselves because we didn't trust our 3PLs. And, and our product was really complicated, so it needed a higher touch and some like institutional knowledge. By this time, we had like 600 SKUs, so
Got it.
we're bouncing all around in the story. But as I'm helping my effectively friends and then friends of friends, and the kind of network effect of people who wanted to use Gear's stack to get their products to
This is
market.
while you still own gear, before you've sold gear.
I still own Gear, but it didn't have a name. It was just me helping my friends or people that my
Right.
friends knew or whatever. And
Yeah.
so we became quietly and like it unexpectedly a design agency, a supply chain management contract manufacturing agency, and a 3PL. And we just started to like define how we would deliver those products to people that weren't ourselves and what it ought to cost. And by the time we sold Gear, that business was like running, really running, and it just didn't have a name. It was just people would just email me at Gear.
Did you keep did you keep your did you have your own manufacturing facilities, and did you keep them when you sold gear?
Yeah, I had invested in factories, and TLDR, I'm not as invested directly now. There were some things about managing such a high cash flow business from so far. They were like mostly in China, but I thought, like this is kind of better if I'm not so exposed. I've been so
Mm.
personally exposed to so many of the businesses that we've run because they've been bootstrapped, and that was one where I felt like without me committing to being there for a significant portion of every month or every quarter, it was just too much money floating around to get comfortable
Yep.
with. So I pulled back from it. But at the time, it was like sort of a joint venture type of a thing. And now
Yeah.
it looks a lot more like traditional contract manufacturing. We have like an
Yeah.
incredible Rolodex of manufacturers that we've worked with, and we kind of know how to find other manufacturing partners, and it's global now, so it's not so
Yeah.
much just in like kind of Asia Pacific, but we're making all sorts of things all over the world. So that business really grew from like, let me make things that are of a kind with my silicone spatula at my silicone factory, to I will just help you get anything done anywhere in the world, from like shoes to baby onesies to I don't know, like glass measuring cups.
Yeah. Any consumer product, effectively.
Any consumer product, because the way of working, the how of getting that done is pretty transferable. And my manufacturing knowledge, I mean 15 years later, is like pretty expansive. So
Right.
I generally understand most of the methodologies, I generally understand most materials, and I can be a good thought partner for someone who's like, I want to make this random widget in this kind of a way. And I'm like, okay, well, here's how parts are going to come together. So that business is called Mvnifest. So Gear kind of led to Voltaire, sort of pivoted, but just morphed. And Voltaire kind of leapfrogged Mvnifest, but has become Endless because that tech stack is what Endless is. And
Yep.
Mvnifest grew out of our just ability and willingness to help people do other stuff. And originally, we were gonna, just like we were gonna call Voltaire the Gear Grinder, we were gonna call Endless Mvnifest AI, and it was just gonna be like, this is the stack that all of these businesses have used, and then all of our hundreds of clients have used to sort of like operationalize their design. And as I was working through how to create or to maintain the services business alongside a software business, I thought, like these models are really different. And maybe I can contain the multitudes, but like the software is a venture scale business, and I need to position it in a way that acknowledges that, so that I can get the help that I need and the funding that I need to like really, really bring it to the moon. And I so deeply believe in this as like something that there's just deep customer need for, and that really excited about bringing to market. So I'm like, okay, we'll spin this out and we'll just make it clean, and I'm going to focus all of my time on this. And so I have like different management teams now for the other businesses, and I've sold a couple of them, and that's given me like the freedom and the time to focus on the thing that is like really, really going to be, the rocket ship. At least I hope.
It comes back to a question I had earlier, but do you feel like this is sort of like the culmination of the last 15 years? Because the way you talk about Endless, and in fact, the way you talk about sort of Endless being a VC-backed company, it almost feels like in your head, this is like this is where you really wanted to go, but you took some detours around the way that were very profitable and very interesting and awesome. But like that, I don't know, it kind of feels like you feel like, like there's a sigh of like, this is the thing that like I've always wanted to build, but I didn't know what it was going to be. And now I found it. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair. I think I'm excited about it for a few reasons. And you're right. I couldn't have gotten here without the path. I mean,
you had the domain knowledge. You have the domain knowledge that makes a business like this so important to the partners, right? Without domain knowledge, then who cares?
Yeah, like anyone could build, some of the infrastructure that we build. As a technology business, it's no more technological than any other basic SaaS. Really, it's the domain knowledge that counts. And so I'm very grateful for having gone through all of these different beats of like, let's build a simple consumer products business. Now let's build like an IoT consumer products business and an app. That was like a learning curve. I think I'm faster at being a good leader for a pure SaaS play because I've had these other experiences of like building simpler SaaS, which is like a subscription service
Right.
for coffee beans, and having built all these consumer products, and having really committed to just the full body of knowledge that goes into zero to oneing a physical good.
Right. It's very different than selling just a piece of software. Like you are actually dealing with goods that are breakable, that need to be moved from place to place, that people are going to touch and feel, and needs to be safe.
Yeah.
It's a totally different thing than like what I've been doing.
Yeah, it's and that affects the approach to building the software, right? You're like
Right.
constantly sort of maintaining some awareness to the physicality of it when you build software, like for inventory management, for example, because you have to know, like, well, the inventory that you're implying, it's a number on a screen, but it's also a box on a shelf somewhere that someone's gonna go touch. They're going to touch it. They're going to open it. They're going to take stuff out. They're going to put stuff back in. They're going to put that stuff in another box. They're going to move it to another shelf. They're going to tape it. They're going to send it to a customer. The customer is going to say something about it. Maybe they're going to return it. What happens then? So, it's this amazing machine that I just love, like the orchestration of kind of like all these pieces and parts. I think the other reason why I view Endless as a real, not only culmination, but the thing that like I'm deeply excited about is that it is, I think, the way that we can help the most people. Like I can help some number of people with supply chain management or being a 3PL. I can make their product journeys and their founder journeys easier by imparting knowledge as a service or services as a service in those businesses. But I am like super driven to help the people that are like, I don't know, this is maybe too glorifying, but have enough gumption to try to turn an idea into a physical object. That journey of like idea to reality I'm super obsessed with it. And it's hard and it's expensive. And for the folks that are like, F it, I'm going to do it anyway. I'm like, you're my person, I'm your person. Like, I want to help you do that. And like, if I can just show you a couple of things that I had to learn the hard way that you might be able to learn the easier way, then like mission accomplished. Doing that with SaaS at scale, I can touch the most people. And that I think is just like, that's worth getting up out of bed at like 5 a.m. for.
I love that. Wow. What a story with twists and turns and skips and backs and zigzags. Like that's really, really fascinating. I really want to thank you for being on the podcast today. What an awesome conversation. Tell people where they can find you, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, whatever it is, and anything about Endless Commerce that you want to say.
For sure. Yeah. So endlesscommerce.com, spelled like it sounds. And
I'll put the spelling in the show notes.
I had to do that for a few of my other companies. It's like Mvnifest, but with a V. So I've learned my lesson.
Voltaire with an E at the end.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm not particularly active on Twitter, but I'm at Sorry Robots on Twitter, and maybe putting it out there in that way will encourage me to be more active. Yeah, if you're building a brand, scaling a brand, I'm super stoked to help. So hit me up. I will answer any question, big or small, especially if it's about rocket science.
Starting at 5 a.m. in the morning. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Again, this has been another episode of the Hard Pivot with Zach Roseman, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers. Take care.